I have kept patient records for 43 years. They fill 11 ledgers on the shelf above my desk, each one bound in brown cloth and labeled by year. In the careful hand I developed in Philadelphia, when I still believed that precision in record-keeping was the same thing as precision in medicine. The ledgers begin in 1878, which is the year I arrived in Harlan Creek, Nebraska Territory, with a medical bag, a reasonable education, and a confidence in both that the following winters would slowly and thoroughly correct. I am writing this in October of 1921. Outside my window, the cottonwoods along the creek have gone the color of old brass, and the sky has that particular quality of Great Plains autumn, enormous, clear, and carrying within its clarity the faint warning of what is coming. I have seen 43 of these skies. I no longer need the warning. My body knows the season before the season announces itself. I am writing this because Maren Solberg died in the spring of 1919, quietly, in the same cabin she had occupied for over 40 years, and the 4-sentence obituary printed in the Territorial Gazette mentioned her kitchen garden. It mentioned her kitchen garden. It said she was a longtime resident of Harlan Creek, that she was survived by no immediate family, and that she had been a good neighbor to those who knew her. She had been a good neighbor. I have been sitting with that phrase for 2 years now, the way you sit with a stone in your boot that you have not yet stopped to remove. A good neighbor. As though the most significant thing Maren Solberg did in her time on this earth was to return borrowed tools promptly and not let her fence line drift. I am going to set the record straight. Not because anyone has asked me to, and not because I believe that setting records straight accomplishes very much in the long run. I have been a doctor long enough to know that the world is not generally in the business of correcting its own errors. But because I am the last person still living who was present in the valley during the winter of 1881 and the spring that followed it, and because I have in my possession 11 ledgers of patient records that prove, in the dry language of medicine, exactly what Maren Solberg did and exactly who she did it for. She solved the problem that was quietly killing this valley's children. She solved it not with medicine, not with money, and not with any tool that a man riding past her property on a November morning could have seen or named. She solved it with a shovel, a north-facing hill, and a quality of attention to the natural world that I have spent 4 decades trying to approximate in my own work and have never quite achieved. This is her story. I will tell it as carefully as I can, which means I will tell some of it poorly, because the parts I understand best are the parts she explained to me afterward, and the parts she explained to me were not the most important parts. The most important parts she never explained to anyone. She simply did them, quietly, over the course of one autumn, while the valley watched and understood nothing of what it was watching. I need to tell you about February 1st, because without February, nothing else in this story has its proper weight. In the 7 winters before 1881, I lost at least 1 child patient in the month of February, sometimes 2. The deaths were recorded in my ledger under various causes: respiratory failure, cardiac weakness, fever complications, and all of those notations were accurate in the narrow technical sense that the child's lungs or heart had indeed been the final thing to fail. But accuracy of that kind, I have come to understand, is its own form of imprecision. I was recording the last event in a sequence without recording the sequence itself. What I observed, and what I did not have the vocabulary to name correctly until several years later, was this. Children who were healthy and vigorous in October became something different by February. Not sick, exactly. Not presenting with the clear symptoms of any disease I had been trained to diagnose. They became gray. They became slow. Small cuts and scrapes that should have healed in a week were still open at the edges 3 weeks later. Their gums, when I examined them, showed a puffiness that I had seen described in my medical texts in the context of sailors on long ocean voyages, but which I had never connected to farmers in Nebraska because the situations seemed so obviously different. I would ask their mothers what they had been eating. The answer was always the same: dried beans, salted pork, cornmeal, dried apples when the supply held. Sometimes a little hard cheese from the autumn making. Whatever Harlan Voss had available at the store, purchased on credit against the spring harvest. It was adequate food. It kept children alive. But by February, something in it was insufficient in a way that I could see in children's faces and measure in the slowness of their healing, and which I did not yet have the correct framework to explain. The framework, when it finally came to me, came partly from my own belated reading and partly from a conversation with Maren Solberg in the spring of 1882, which I will describe in its proper place. But the essential fact is this: the human body needs something during the long winter months that dried and salted food cannot provide. It is present in fresh vegetables. It is destroyed by heat, by salt, by the long processes we use to preserve food through winter. It cannot be stored in a barrel or a smokehouse or a root cellar of the ordinary kind, because the ordinary kinds of root cellars were not built to maintain the precise conditions that keep it alive. Every February for 7 years, I watched children suffer from the absence of that something, and I treated them with iron supplements and warm broth, and the confident reassurances of a man who did not understand the actual problem. And every spring, when the green things came back to the valley and fresh food returned to the table, the children recovered, and I attributed their recovery to the warmth and the fresh air and the general improvement of the season, and I wrote nothing in my ledger that would have helped me understand what was actually happening. I was not a bad doctor. I was a doctor who had not yet asked the right question. The right question was not, what disease do these children have? The right question was, what does their body need in February that it is not receiving? Maren Solberg had been asking that question since the winter of 1879. She had been moving toward an answer by a route that had nothing to do with medical school or textbooks for 3 years before the winter that proved her correct. She was 52 years old in the autumn of 1881, though she did not look it in any direction you might mean by that observation. She was not young-looking for her age, nor was she worn in the way that the frontier wore many women who came to it after years of easier circumstances. She was simply what she was, a tall, spare woman of Norwegian origin who had been farming 40 acres of Luss hillside on the north end of the Harlan Creek Valley for 14 years, first with her husband Eric, and then, after Eric's death from pneumonia in the winter of 1877, alone. She had no children living in Nebraska. She had come from Telemark as a young married woman, and whatever she had left behind in Norway, and whatever she had lost in the years since, she kept in the manner of a person who considers private things private. She was not unfriendly. She was simply precise in her friendships, as some people are precise in their accounting, keeping careful track of what was given and what was owed, and never allowing the balance to become confused. Her farm was the northernmost property in the valley's settled area, which meant that the road past her cabin was not a road that anyone traveled unless they were going to her specifically. Most people in Harlan Creek went to see Maren Solberg when they needed something she was known to have. Good seed saved carefully from reliable stock, a particular kind of practical advice about the less soil that most of her neighbors farmed less successfully than she did, or the company of a woman who would listen without offering more opinion than the situation required. I visited her in a professional capacity twice in those early years, once for a sprained wrist from a fence-mending accident, and once for a respiratory infection in the winter of 1880 that she had allowed to progress further than she should have before sending for me. She was not a difficult patient, but she was an observant one. She watched everything I did with the same quality of attention she brought to her soil and her seeds, not mistrustfully, but with the clear intention of understanding the mechanism behind the procedure. It was during the second visit, while I was listening to her lungs and she was sitting very still, in the way that people who are accustomed to managing discomfort sit still, that she asked me something I have thought about many times since. She asked me what I thought caused children to do poorly in February. I gave her the answer I gave everyone who asked me similar questions. The cold, the confinement, the reduced activity of winter. The usual answer. The answer that was not wrong exactly but was not right enough to be useful. She nodded. She did not say what she thought the correct answer was. She thanked me for coming and paid me in a dozen eggs, which was the currency of the valley and perfectly acceptable to me. And I drove my buggy back down the North Road thinking about other things entirely. She had been thinking about it, I later learned, for considerably longer than I had. In the summer of 1881, Maren Solberg spent her mornings walking the north-facing slope behind her cabin. Her neighbor Britta Halverson, who farmed the adjacent property and had been Maren's closest friend in the valley for a decade, noticed this and mentioned it with the mild concern of someone who has watched a friend do inexplicable things before and has learned to wait for the explanation. She asked Maren what she was looking for on that hill. Maren said she was reading the soil. Britta, who was a sensible woman of Bergen origin with 7 children and no patience for mysticism, said that she had been reading the soil on her own property for 12 years, and the soil had never told her anything she couldn't have figured out by simply planting something and seeing what happened. Maren agreed that this was one method. She said she preferred to understand the character of a thing before she asked something of it. Britta watched her friend press a handful of pale yellow lust between both palms, release it, and examine the impression it left on her skin. She watched Maren crouch down and put the flat of her hand against the hillside for a long moment, as though she were feeling for a pulse. "What are you going to do with that hill?" Britta asked. "Something useful," Maren said. Britta Halverson had known Maren Solberg for 10 years. She knew that something useful meant that the conversation was finished for now, and that whatever Maren was planning would either work or it wouldn't, and that discussing it in advance would not change either outcome. She went home and put water on for supper and did not think much more about the hill until October, when she noticed that Maren had begun to move dirt. By then, the question of what Maren was building had become a subject of quiet discussion in the valley. The answer most people settled on was that she was not building anything. She was a widow, farming 40 acres alone, and the season was wrong for any serious construction, and there was no timber arriving from the mill and no hardware visible from the road, and a woman in her situation did not begin major building projects in October without a good reason that she would certainly have mentioned to somebody. The most charitable interpretation was that she was improving her drainage. The least charitable was that she was simply having a difficult autumn and occupying herself with movement. Harlan Voss, when someone mentioned it to him at the store, said that he had not seen Maren Solberg's winter supply order yet, and that if she had the energy to move dirt in October, she had the energy to come and settle her account, and that is what she ought to be doing. Nobody disagreed with him, because nobody in the valley disagreed with Harlan Voss about practical matters in October. October was his season. He was the man who stood between the valley and the winter, and everyone knew it, and everyone was grateful for it, in the way you are grateful for something you have never had to do without. Nobody walked up the North Road to ask Maren directly what she was doing, because nobody had a reason to go to Maren's farm in October, and because the question, if she was simply managing her grief in the only way available to her, would have been unkind. So the valley went about its autumn business, and Maren Solberg moved dirt to the creek in the afternoons, and the North Hill changed its shape by increments too small to measure from the road. And the winter of 1881 began to assemble itself on the horizon, patient and immense and entirely indifferent to what any of them were or were not preparing for. I asked her once, in the spring of 1882, where the idea had come from. She was quiet for a moment in the way she was often quiet, not because she was uncertain of the answer, but because she was deciding how much of the answer was mine to have. We were standing outside her cabin in the thin March light, the snow still present in the shaded places, and she was looking at the North Hill with the expression of someone reviewing completed work. She said, from 3 places. And then she said nothing more for long enough that I understood she was going to require a more specific question before she continued. I asked about the first place. She said, "My father's hands." Magnus Larsson had been a farmer in Telemark, in the high interior of Norway, where the winters were not merely cold, but were a seasonal fact of such magnitude that the entire architecture of rural life was organized around surviving them. He was not an educated man in any formal sense. He had not read the natural philosophers or studied the properties of soil in any institution. What he had was something that takes longer to acquire than education and cannot be transferred by any method except proximity and time. He had 40 years of specific, repeated, corrected observation of how the earth in that particular valley behaved across all 4 seasons, and he had passed as much of it as he could to his daughter in the years before she left for America. The kjeller, the traditional Norwegian root cellar, was not his invention. It was older than anyone in Telemark could trace, a technique carried forward through generations of farmers who had learned, over centuries of trial and failure, that the earth maintains a stable temperature at depth regardless of what the air above it is doing. Dig far enough into a hillside, shape the chamber correctly, allow the right amount of the right kind of air to move through it at the right rate, and you have created a space where the rules of winter do not fully apply, where a carrot placed in October will still be a carrot in March. Maren had watched her father build one when she was a girl of perhaps 11 or 12. She had not been taught it systematically. She had been present for it, which is a different thing. She had carried soil in a bucket and held a lamp while her father tapped the walls to hear their density and pressed his palm to the clay floor and counted silently to 20. She had watched him make small adjustments she did not understand at the time, tilting the angle of the ventilation channel slightly, redirecting the airflow by moving a flat stone a matter of inches, and she had absorbed the image of these adjustments without absorbing their full reasoning. What she had taken from that hillside in Telemark was not a blueprint. It was a principle, and a fragmentary one at that. The earth is not cold. The air is cold. These are different things, and the difference between them can be made useful. She had arrived in Nebraska with that principle stored somewhere behind her practical knowledge, behind her seed saving and her fence mending and the daily labor of making a farm function in a new soil on a new continent. It had waited there for 14 years until the winter of 1879, when she began to understand what February was actually doing to the children of the valley, and the principle moved forward from wherever it had been waiting and presented itself. That was the first source. The second was different in kind. In her second winter in Nebraska, 1876, the year before Eric died, Maren had developed the habit of walking the creek in the early mornings when the light was flat and the land showed its structure most clearly. It was a practice from Telemark, reading landscape before the day's activity obscured it, and it was on one of these walks that she had first encountered the woman she knew only by the location where she occasionally appeared, the creek crossing 3 miles east of the Solberg property, where a shallow ford allowed passage in all but the highest water. The woman was Lakota, older than Maren by perhaps 20 years, and she had come to trade dried corn at the crossing with 2 younger women who waited further back on the eastern bank. She spoke no English that she chose to use in Maren's presence, and Maren spoke no Lakota at all, and so their exchanges were brief and transactional. But Maren was, above all other things, an observer, and what she observed over the course of 3 or 4 encounters across that second winter was something she stored with the same care she stored her seeds. The older woman kept her food in a depression on the north face of a low hill approximately 100 yards from the crossing. It was not a dramatic structure, barely visible unless you were looking for it, which Maren was. A low entrance, reinforced with flat stones around the frame, facing precisely north, set into the hill at an angle that Maren eventually understood was not the steepest available approach, but a deliberate calculation about how much earth should sit above the storage chamber. The woman went to it each morning and took from it only what she needed for the day, and then closed it again with a care that suggested she understood exactly what conditions she was maintaining inside. Marin had never spoken of this to anyone in the valley. It was not her story to tell. But she had kept the image of that hill in the same internal place she kept her father's palm pressed flat against the clay floor, and when she began to think seriously about the problem of winter food in 1879, the two images had found each other in her mind and produced something neither one could have produced alone. The north-facing slope, the deliberate angle, the earth above as insulation, not as obstacle. These were the first two sources. The third was a failure, and it was in some ways the most important of the three. In October of 1880, Marin had built a cellar. It was small, barely 8 feet into the hillside behind the cabin, low-ceilinged, shaped by instinct rather than calculation. She had filled it in late October with carrots and turnips and several pounds of apples wrapped in straw, and she had checked it weekly through November and December with a cautious hope she had not shared with anyone. By the second week of January 1881, everything in it had rotted. Not from cold. The temperature inside the chamber had remained stable, which told her the location and depth were sound. The problem was moisture. The air inside the chamber had been too still, too saturated, accumulating the respiration of the vegetables themselves until the humidity passed the threshold at which decay accelerates. She had built a room with no lungs, and everything inside it had slowly drowned in its own exhalation. She had removed the rotted stores on a gray morning in January, carrying load after load to the compost heap, and she had sat afterward in her cold kitchen for a long time before she put water on for tea. I asked her once how long she sat there. She said, "Long enough to understand what I had done wrong." Then I got up. What the failure taught her was this. A storage chamber is not a sealed box, it is a breathing system. The vegetables inside it are alive, slowly, quietly alive, in the way that living things in cold conditions are alive. And they require air that moves, air that carries away the invisible products of their slow metabolism, air that does not accumulate until it becomes the agent of their destruction. The chamber needed ventilation. Not the ventilation of a barn or a cabin where air moves freely and temperature varies wildly, but a controlled, calibrated ventilation. Enough movement to keep the air clean, not so much that the cold followed the air inside. The question was how to achieve that. The question occupied her through the remainder of the winter of 1881 and into the spring and summer, while she walked the North Hill in the early mornings and read the soil and thought about air. By September, she had an answer, or the beginning of one. The design she arrived at was not drawn on paper. Marin did not draw plans. She worked the way her father had worked, in 3 dimensions in her mind, revising and testing the mental model against everything she knew about soil and air and temperature until the contradictions resolved themselves. I have tried, in the years since, to describe this process in terms that would make sense to another doctor or to an engineer, and I have never found language that quite fits. It was not intuition, which implies something arrived at without reasoning. It was reasoning of a kind that did not require paper because the person doing it had sufficient experience with the physical materials that the materials themselves served as the medium of thought. What she had settled on by the time the first hard frost arrived in early October was this. The chamber would be dug into the north-facing slope at an angle of roughly 15 degrees below horizontal, not straight back into the hill, but slightly downward, so that any water that found its way inside would drain toward the entrance rather than collect at the back. The ceiling would be shaped as an arch, not flat, because an arch distributes the weight of the earth above it along its curve rather than concentrating it at the center. She had seen this principle in the stone bridges of Telemark and in the photographs of Roman construction she had once examined in a book borrowed from the Territorial Land Office. And she understood it not as history or engineering, but as geometry. The curve wants to stay where it is put. The chamber would be divided into 3 sections by low walls of packed clay. The section nearest the entrance, where the air was coolest, would hold apples and pears. The middle section, a few degrees warmer, would hold carrots and turnips and parsnips. The deepest section, warmest of all, would hold onions and garlic and the winter squash she had grown along the south fence specifically for this purpose. And the ventilation, 2 channels of fired clay, each the diameter of a man's fist, running through the upper portion of the hill. The intake channel entered the hillside 20 feet east of the cellar entrance, ran horizontally through 6 feet of insulating earth, and opened into the upper wall of the middle chamber. The exhaust channel exited the middle chamber on the opposite wall, ran horizontally through the hill, and opened on the far side of the slope, facing west into the prevailing wind, which created a natural draft that would draw air slowly through the chamber without pulling the cold in behind it. The difference in aperture size between the 2 channels was not accidental. The intake was slightly narrower than the exhaust. This was the detail she had worked out over the course of several weeks, and it was the detail that no one who copied her system later ever quite replicated correctly. By making the intake narrower, she ensured that air moved into the chamber more slowly than it moved out, creating a slight negative pressure inside the chamber that drew the air through without pushing it. The vegetables sat in air that was always moving away from them, always carrying their exhalation outward, never allowing the moisture and gases of their slow respiration to accumulate. She had arrived at this by watching how her father adjusted the ventilation stone in the Telemark Kjeller, an image she had carried for 30 years without fully understanding it. And she had confirmed it in a small way by observing the creek-crossing cellar of the Lakota woman, whose exhaust opening she had eventually located on a later walk, cut into the hill at a position and angle that she now understood was doing the same work by a different configuration. The earth remembers how to keep things alive, she told me once. We only have to ask it in the right way. She began digging on the 3rd day of October. The morning was cold and clear, the cottonwoods along the creek already yellowing, the sky enormous above the Luss Hills in the way that Great Plains is enormous in autumn, as though the land, having given up its crops, has nothing left to interrupt the distance. She carried her spade and her pickaxe up the slope behind the cabin, and she stood for a moment at the place she had been walking all summer, and then she put the spade to the earth, the loess cut cleanly. This was the first confirmation that the site was correct. Loess in good condition separates from itself with a precision that other soils do not, leaving a face that holds its shape rather than crumbling, that can be worked with a tool rather than merely moved. She cut a low rectangle into the hillside, the top of the opening at shoulder height, and began to work inward at the 15-degree angle she had calculated. The smell of it reached her immediately. It is a smell particular to undisturbed loess, dry and faintly mineral, with a warmth underneath it that has nothing to do with the air temperature and everything to do with the depth from which it comes. She had smelled it in Telemark as a child, standing at the edge of the cellar her father was digging, and the smell reached her now, across 30 years, with the quality of a physical memory, the kind stored not in the mind but somewhere more specific, in the back of the nose, in the palms of the hands. She worked until noon. She removed approximately 18 inches of depth from the opening section, enough to begin feeling the temperature change that she had been measuring with her palm all summer. At 8 inches, the soil was still cool in the way of October soil. At 14 inches, something shifted, a steadiness in the temperature, a quality of the earth that was no longer responding to the air above it, but maintaining its own internal condition. She set her spade down and pressed both palms flat against the exposed face of the cut. She counted to 20, the way her father had counted to 20. The earth held its warmth against her hands with the patience of something that has been doing this for a very long time and expects to continue. She picked up her spade and kept digging. Britta Halverson came by on the 5th day, as Maren had known she would. Britta's route to the trading post passed close enough to the North Hill that she would have seen the fresh cut in the slope from the road. And Britta was not a woman who walked past a thing she did not understand without stopping to examine it. She stood at the base of the hill with her hands in her coat pockets and looked at what Maren had started. The opening was perhaps 2 feet high and 3 feet wide, with the day's removed soil piled neatly to the side in a quantity that told Britta this was not a small project or a recent impulse. She asked how far in it went. 6 feet, Maren said. She needed 11 more before she could begin the arch. Britta looked at the sky and then at the opening and then at Maren. She said, "The soil here is different from Norway soil." Maren said, "The cold here is the same as Norway cold." Britta stood for another moment. She had been friends with this woman for 10 years, and she had developed over those 10 years a reliable sense of which of Maren's projects were grief working itself out in physical labor and which were something else. This felt like something else. It felt deliberate in a way that made Britta slightly uneasy, because she had watched enough careful plans come apart on this frontier to distrust the ones that looked most carefully made. She asked what Maren intended to put in it. "Carrots," Maren said. "Turnips. The squash from the south fence. Apples." "Through winter," Britta said. It wasn't quite a question. "Through winter," Maren said. Britta looked at the opening in the hillside once more. Then she said, with the specific gentleness of a woman delivering a difficult truth to someone she loves, "Maren, we have both been in this valley for 14 years. Every woman in this valley has tried to keep root vegetables alive past January. Every one of us has opened our cellars in February and found rot. You know this. You have seen it in your own cellar." "I know," Maren said. "Then what makes you think," Britta said, "that this will be different?" Maren set her spade against the hillside and turned to look at her friend with an expression that Britta later described to me as the look of someone who has already finished an argument in their own mind and is mildly surprised to find it still ongoing in the outside world. She said, "Because this time I understand why they rot." Britta walked on to the trading post. She carried Maren's answer with her the way you carry a stone you have picked up without quite deciding whether to keep it, and she was still carrying it when she returned in the afternoon, and she carried it all through October as the opening in the North Hill grew deeper, and the pile of removed soil grew larger, and the question of what Maren Solberg was building began its slow circulation through the valley. The answer most people gave was, "Nothing that will work." They were not unreasonable people for thinking so. They were people who had tried before, and who had learned what February did to careful plans, and who had no framework for understanding that what was going into the North Hill was not another version of what had failed before. They had no framework for it because no one in the valley had seen it done correctly. The knowledge had crossed an ocean once, in one woman's memory, and had waited there quietly for 14 years until the problem was desperate enough, and the understanding was complete enough, and the hill was exactly the right hill. And now the spade was in the earth, and the earth was warm. There is a particular kind of work that does not announce its difficulty until you are too far into it to reconsider. I have encountered this in medicine, the diagnosis that seemed straightforward until the 3rd week of treatment, when something that should have been resolving began instead to complicate, and you found yourself standing at the bedside of a patient with the growing awareness that what you were managing was not the condition you had thought you were managing. The work had changed its nature somewhere behind you, and you had not noticed until you turned around and the entrance was no longer visible. Maren Solberg encountered this on the 14th day of October. She had by that point dug the main chamber to its full depth, 17 feet into the hillside, with the ceiling height at the center of the arch reaching just above 6 feet. The arch itself had taken 4 days to shape, and shaping it was the work she had been most uncertain about, because an arch is an idea as much as it is a structure, and the idea requires the builder to resist every instinct to straighten what she has made. The natural inclination when cutting a ceiling is to cut it flat, because flat is measurable, and flat is familiar, and flat gives you the reassuring right angle of a room you have lived in. An arch gives you nothing familiar. It gives you a curve that looks, at every stage of its construction, as though it is about to become something other than what you intend. Her father had told her, "Trust the geometry, not your eye. Your eye wants flat. The stone wants curve. Listen to the stone." She had cut the arch slowly, removing thin layers at a time and stepping back frequently to sight along the curve with a bent willow branch she had shaped to the radius she wanted. When the ceiling finally matched the branch along its entire length, she set the branch down and stood in the chamber and looked up at what she had made. And the arch looked exactly as it should look, inevitable, as though the hill had always contained it and she had merely revealed it. She began the partition walls on day 11. The walls were to be low, approximately 3 feet high, enough to create distinct temperature zones within the chamber without blocking the airflow she needed to move through all 3 sections. She constructed them of packed clay, pressed into forms she had made from split boards, building each wall in courses and allowing each course to begin hardening before adding the next. It was slow work. It required the clay to be at a precise moisture content, wet enough to pack without crumbling, dry enough to hold its shape without slumping. And achieving that consistency meant carrying water from the cabin in careful amounts and working it into the excavated soil by hand until the texture was correct. On day 14, she pressed the final course onto the partition wall between the cool section and the middle chamber, smoothed it with her palm, and stepped back to look at the hole. The crack appeared the following morning. It ran from the top of the partition wall down approximately 18 inches, not straight but in the slight diagonal that cracks prefer, following some invisible line of lesser resistance in the clay, some seam she had not known was there. It was perhaps the width of a thumbnail at the top and narrowed to a hairline at its lower end, and it had appeared, as cracks do, without warning and without any particular drama, simply presenting itself to her lamp when she arrived to begin the day's firing work. She set her lamp on the floor and looked at the crack for a long time. I asked her later what she thought in that moment. She said, "I thought about what my father would say. Then I thought about what I knew. Then I thought about the creek. The problem was not the crack itself. A crack of that size, in a wall that would not bear structural load, was manageable. The problem was what the crack revealed about the clay she was working with. The loess of the Harlan Creek Valley was not the clay of Telemark. It was lighter, more porous, and it responded to the rapid drying of the firing process differently than the dense glacial clay her father had used. It shrank slightly as it dried, and where it shrank unevenly, it separated. If she fired the walls as she had planned, she would likely get more cracks in more places, and the temperature separation between chambers that her entire design depended on would be compromised. She needed a different material or a different mixture. She thought about the creek, the bank of Harlan Creek, at the point where a small spring fed in from the east, had a particular deposit of clay that she had noticed on her morning walks, darker than the less, heavier, with the slightly greasy quality of clay that has been wet for a long time and has become something more cohesive than soil. She had seen this clay before in another context. Her neighbor to the south, an older German farmer named Brenner, had used it to chink the gaps in his stone chimney, and the chinking had held through 4 winters without cracking. Chimney clay. Clay that lived next to fire and did not separate. She walked to the creek that morning and filled a bucket with the dark clay from the spring bank. She carried it back to the cabin and mixed it with wood ash from the kitchen stove. Fine ash, the kind that remains after a long, clean burn, in the ratio that felt right to her hands, which is to say, in the ratio that produced a mixture that held its shape when compressed, but did not stick to her palms when she opened them. She applied this mixture to the crack, pressing it in firmly and smoothing it flush with the surrounding surface. Then she waited 3 days. On the morning of the 3rd day, she pressed on the repair with her thumb. It had cured to a hardness that the original clay had not achieved, denser, less yielding, with the quality of something that had found its final form and was not interested in changing it. She pressed harder. The repair did not move. She rebuilt the lower portion of both partition walls using the creek clay and ash mixture. The firing went differently this time. No cracking, no shrinkage, the walls darkening evenly to a color close to charcoal as the slow fire moved through them over 2 days. When they cooled, she tapped them with her knuckle at intervals, listening, as her father had listened, for the particular sound of clay that has become something closer to ceramic, a clear, flat note with no resonance, the sound of density, the sound of a material that has settled its internal arguments. Both walls spoke clearly. She had lost 4 days. She did not adjust her manner in response to this. She simply incorporated the 4 days into her remaining schedule and moved on to the ventilation channels. The ventilation channels were the part of the project that she had thought about longest and understood most incompletely, which made them the part she approached with the greatest care. She had dug the pilot holes for both channels before beginning the main chamber, 2 horizontal shafts running through the hillside at the level of the upper wall, their placement calculated so that the intake entered the chamber near the cooler front section, and the exhaust exited near the warmer rear, creating a flow path that would move air slowly through all 3 zones before releasing it. The channels were lined with sections of fired clay pipe she had made herself over the previous summer, short cylinders of creek clay, fired in the outdoor kiln she used for her seed storage crocks, fitted together and sealed at the joints with the ash clay mixture. The principle was sound. The execution required confirmation. On the evening of the 17th day, with the partition walls complete and the fired clay lining of the main chamber cool to the touch, she brought a single candle into the cellar and closed both the inner and outer doors behind her. She stood in the complete darkness for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to nothing, and then she lit the candle. A candle flame in still air is a simple thing. It stands upright. It flickers only in response to disturbance, and it tells you very little about the air around it. A candle flame in moving air is a measuring instrument. It leans toward lower pressure and away from higher pressure, and the angle and steadiness of its lean tells a patient observer something about the speed and direction and consistency of the airflow. She moved through the chamber slowly, holding the candle at various heights and positions, watching the flame. At the intake opening, the flame pressed inward. Air was moving in, as intended. At the exhaust opening, the flame pressed toward the wall. Air was moving out. These were the expected results, and they confirmed the basic function of the system. What she was looking for was subtler. She needed to know how the air moved through the middle section of the chamber, where the carrots and turnips would be stored, and whether it moved at a rate sufficient to carry away the moisture and gases of their respiration without moving so quickly that the cold from the intake overcame the insulating effect of the surrounding earth. She stood in the middle section for a long time, watching the flame. It leaned, not sharply, not the lean of a draft or a gap in the structure, but with a slow, steady inclination of perhaps 10 degrees from vertical in the direction of the exhaust channel. 10 degrees. She had no instrument to translate that angle into a volume of airflow per hour. She had only the accumulated knowledge of what a 10-degree lean meant in practical terms, derived from a memory of her father making the same observation in telemark and making a small adjustment and making the observation again. She went outside and adjusted the exhaust channel opening by placing a flat stone against its lower edge, reducing the aperture by approximately 1/4. She went back inside and lit the candle again. 7 degrees. Better. The air was moving at a rate she could not measure, but could feel was correct. Present but not insistent. A movement more like breathing than like wind. She closed the cellar and walked back to the cabin in the dark. By the last week of October, the sky had changed. It is difficult to describe this change to someone who has not spent a winter on the Great Plains, because the change is not visual in any simple sense. The sky does not darken or lower or present any particular formation that a traveler from a milder climate would identify as threatening. What changes is its quality, something in the light, something in the way the horizon sits against the land, something in the silence that the wind leaves behind it when it stops. People who have lived here long enough develop a physical awareness of this change before they develop the language for it. And the awareness presents itself not as a thought, but as a response. The hands look for work that needs doing inside. The body begins its unconscious calculation of wood and food, and the distance between one warm place and the next. I had developed this awareness by my third winter in the valley, and in the last week of October 1881, it informed me with the flat certainty of a clinical observation that the coming winter would be severe. I was not alone in this reading. The valley had other instruments. The older Norwegian farmers spoke of the way their joints felt, a specific kind of pressure that they distinguished from the ordinary ache of age and identified with a particular quality of coming cold. Britta Halverson's husband, Gunnar, who had been farming the same 40 acres for 16 years, told me in early October that he had doubled his firewood order from the mill and intended to spend the next 3 weeks reinforcing the east wall of his barn. He could not have said precisely what he had seen or felt that led him to this decision. He had simply arrived at it the way a man arrives at a decision after long experience, not through reasoning, but through the accumulated weight of having been wrong before. Harlan Voss read the change in his inventory. In the first week of October, the families of the valley began coming to his store with a different quality of urgency than usual. Not panicked. The frontier had taught most of them to distrust panic as an instrument of good decision-making, but purposeful and slightly compressed, as though the window for preparation was narrowing faster than the calendar justified. They bought salt and dried beans in larger quantities. They asked about the availability of coal, which Voss stocked in limited supply for the families who could afford the railhead price. They asked, several of them, whether his dried apple supply was adequate for the season. It was. He had ordered carefully, as he always ordered. He told them so with the calm authority of a man who has managed this community through 8 previous winters and has not yet failed in that management. He did not mention that he had also, quietly, placed a supplementary order with the railhead agent for additional dried goods, to arrive before the first hard freeze. He had not told anyone about this order because it was the kind of information that could create the panic he considered counterproductive. He would receive the goods and distribute them as needed through the winter, and the valley would not know how close the margin had been, and order would be maintained. Harlan Voss was not a cruel man. He was a man whose identity was so thoroughly organized around the management of the valley's winter survival that he could not clearly distinguish between what was good for the valley and what was good for his own sense of necessary presence within it. This is not an unusual condition. I have seen it in doctors as well. He had not placed a supplementary order for fresh vegetables because fresh vegetables were not a category that existed in his understanding of winter supply. They could not be stored, transported, or inventoried. They were a summer fact, like warmth and long days, and they ended with summer the way summer ended, completely and without remainder. On the evening of the 31st of October, Maren Solberg carried her harvest into the cellar. She had spent the afternoon in the garden in a light, dry cold that was not yet winter but was no longer autumn, sorting and preparing with the care of someone who understands that how a thing is stored is as important as whether it is stored. The carrots had been trimmed and dried in the thin sun for 3 days. The turnips were packed individually in clean sand she had dried by the stove. The apples, a hardy variety she had grafted herself from a cutting brought from Minnesota 5 years earlier, were wrapped in rye straw, each one separated from its neighbors by at least 2 inches of insulation. She carried them in by lamplight, basket by basket, placing each variety in its designated section of the chamber with the attention of someone arranging not objects, but conditions. The apples in the cool front section, positioned so that none of them touched. The carrots in careful rows in the middle chamber, their cut ends facing the same direction. The turnips in their sand, the onions in their net bags hung from the ceiling pegs, the squash along the back wall of the warm rear section where she had measured every morning for 3 weeks, the temperature that the deep earth maintained without any assistance from her at all. When the last basket was placed and the last net bag hung, she stood in the middle chamber and held her lamp low and looked at what she had built. It was not a dramatic space. It was a room in a hill, clay walls darkened to charcoal, a curved ceiling that cleared her head by 6 inches at its crown, 3 zones of stored food separated by low walls that smelled of creek clay and wood ash, and the faint mineral clarity of fired earth. It was approximately the size of a large bedroom, and it was underground, and it was warmer than the air outside by a margin she could feel on her face the moment she stepped inside. She placed her palm flat on the floor and counted to 20. 51 degrees, she had been measuring it for 2 months. It had not varied by more than 2 degrees in any direction across all of that time, through the variable temperatures of late summer and the dropping temperatures of October, through rain and dry spells and the first 2 frosts. The earth had held its condition with a steadiness that no fire could have provided and no human management could have sustained, simply because it was the earth's nature to hold it. She stood and took her lamp and went back up to the cabin. Outside, the last of the autumn light was leaving the sky above the cottonwoods, and to the northwest, the direction that weather came from in this valley, the horizon had the color and texture that Gunnar Halvorson's joints had been reporting for 3 weeks. A deep, bruised purple that was not the purple of sunset but of pressure, of mass, of something enormous, gathering itself at a distance that was, for the moment, still sufficient, but only for the moment. She put water on for tea and sat down at the kitchen table and listened to the wind begin to find the corners of the cabin, and she thought about what was in the hill behind her, and about what February would bring to the children of the valley this year, and about whether what she had built would prove equal to what was coming. She did not know yet. She had the principle, and she had the construction, and she had the measurement of 51 degrees taken every morning for 2 months. Whether that was enough to hold against what the northwest horizon was assembling was a question that only the winter could answer. The winter, in her experience, was not interested in what you hoped. It was interested only in what you had actually built. She drank her tea. She went to bed. Outside, the temperature dropped 11 degrees between sunset and midnight, and kept dropping, and the stars above the Loess Hills burned with the particular cold brilliance of stars that have no warmth to offer and know it. The hard winter of 1881 arrived without the courtesy of a gradual introduction. I have read, in the years since, the meteorological records kept at the Territorial Land Office for that period, and the numbers are precise and entirely inadequate to describe what those weeks were like to live inside. What the numbers say is this: on the 7th of January, the temperature in the Harlan Creek Valley fell to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit and did not recover above zero for 11 consecutive days. 3 successive storms moved through from the northwest at intervals of 4 to 6 days, each one depositing between 14 and 20 inches of dry crystalline snow that the wind redistributed into drifts of sufficient depth to bury a standing horse to its withers. The temperature at the low point of the second storm was recorded at minus 38 degrees. What the numbers do not say is what minus 38 degrees does to a community that is connected across distances of 1 to 4 miles by roads that exist in good conditions as suggestions rather than certainties. What it does is stop movement almost entirely. It reduces the world, for each family, to the volume of space that their stove can keep survivable, and it holds them there for days at a time with the patient indifference of a force that is not hostile to human life specifically, that is simply indifferent to it, the way weather is indifferent, the way January is indifferent. The families of Harlan Creek had prepared for winter as they always prepared, with Voss's dried goods, with their smoked meats and stored grain, with firewood stacked to the eaves of the woodshed and livestock secured in the timber-frame barns that the valley's more established farmers had spent years constructing to the standard specifications of the territory. They had prepared adequately for a severe winter. They had not prepared for what was, by any measure available to me now, the most severe winter in the valley's settled history. By the third week of January, I had not left my house for 6 days. It was Jonas Peterson who reached me first on the morning of the 14th. He had walked the 1.5 miles from his homestead in conditions that I would not have recommended for a healthy man at full strength, and he was not at full strength when he arrived. His face was white at the extremities in the way that signals frostbite in its early stages, and his breathing had the compressed, effortful quality of a man who has been fighting wind for an hour. I brought him inside and put his hands in lukewarm water and listened to what he had come to say. Astrid was 38 weeks along. She had been weakening in the way I had seen women weaken in late winter pregnancies before, not dramatically, not with the clear presentation of a diagnosable illness, but with the slow gray diminishment that I had learned to recognize and had not yet learned to prevent. Her gums were tender. She tired from small efforts. The baby was moving, and her lungs were clear, and her heart was steady, and by every measure I could apply from 1.5 miles away, she was not in immediate danger. But Jonas had looked at his wife for 3 weeks and understood something that his medical vocabulary was insufficient to name, and that understanding had sent him out into -30-degree air to walk to my house. He said, "She needs something I don't have." I gave him iron supplements and told him to make sure she was eating, and even as I said it, I heard the inadequacy of the instruction in my own voice. Eating what precisely? The dried beans and salt pork that constituted the available diet were providing calories. They were not providing what Astrid needed in her 38th week, and Jonas knew it and I knew it, and neither of us had the specific language for the gap between what she had and what she required. He stood in my doorway to leave, and then he stopped. He said, "Maren Solberg gave me carrots in December." I looked at him. "Fresh carrots," he said, "from her hill." I told him that was not possible. Not in December, not in this valley. Every attempt I had ever heard of to keep root vegetables viable past November had failed by January, and most had failed well before that. Jonas looked at me with the expression of a man who has personally eaten the thing you are telling him does not exist. He said, I held them in my hands. I reached Maren's cabin the following morning in a brief window between storms when the wind had dropped enough to make travel possible for a man willing to accept the discomfort of it. The temperature was -19. I had made the trip with my coat collar up and my head down and my mind occupied with the professional calculation of whether what Jonas had described was a genuine medical resource or a memory distorted by the desperation of a worried husband. Maren was awake and had been for hours, as she always was. She opened the door before I knocked, which meant she had heard my boots on the frozen path, and she looked at me with the expression of someone who had been expecting a particular visitor and had simply been uncertain about the timing. I told her what Jonas had said. She put on her coat and took her lamp from the hook by the door and said, "Come." The North Hill was indistinguishable from the surrounding slope under 3 feet of snow, which I understood, as we climbed toward it, was not accidental. The entrance, a low door set into the hillside at the point where the slope angled most sharply, was visible only because Maren knew precisely where to look for it, and even knowing, I nearly walked past it. She cleared the snow from the outer door with a few practiced strokes of a short-handled spade she had carried from the cabin, and opened it, and then opened the inner door behind it, and the warmth came out to meet us. I have thought about that warmth many times in the 40 years since. It was not the aggressive heat of a fire or a well-stoked stove. It was something quieter than that, a steady, emanating warmth that had the quality of something that had been present for a long time and had no intention of leaving. The air that came through the doorway smelled of earth and dry straw and something green and living underneath both. The way soil smells in early spring when the frost has left it and the root systems are waking. It was in the middle of January, in the worst winter the territory had recorded, the smell of a thing that was still alive and intended to remain so. The temperature inside the chamber was 51 degrees. I know this because Marin told me, and I know she was correct because I had been standing in minus 19-degree air for 40 minutes, and the difference was immediate and unmistakable. I stepped inside and stood in the middle section and looked at what she had built. The carrots were in their rows, the turnips were in their sand, the apples, wrapped in rye straw, were stacked along the front section in the cool air near the entrance. The squash hung from the rear ceiling in their net bags, and the onions and garlic were dry and intact on their wooden pegs, and nothing, not one thing in that chamber, showed the color or texture of decay. I am a doctor. I had spent 7 winters watching the consequences of a winter diet that contained none of what was in that room. I stood in the lamplight and looked at the rows of carrots, and I did the arithmetic that I should have done years earlier, and the arithmetic was simple, and its implications were not. The thing that February took from children, the slow gray diminishment, the wounds that would not close, the bleeding gums, the exhaustion that was not laziness, but the body's honest report of a specific absence. That thing was present in those carrots. It was present in the turnips and the stored apples. It was destroyed by salt and heat and the long months of conventional storage, and it was preserved intact and available by exactly the conditions that Marin had spent an autumn engineering into a hillside. She had built a medical intervention. She had not called it that, and would not have used those words, but that is what it was. A structure whose function was to keep alive, through the months when the body most needed them, the specific properties of fresh food that prevent children from dying in February. I stood in her cellar and felt, with a clarity I was not accustomed to in my professional life, the precise dimensions of what I had not understood. The carrots for Astrid Peterson were wrapped in clean cloth and placed in my medical bag alongside the iron supplements, and I carried them back through the frozen valley with considerably more care than I had carried anything in that bag in recent memory. Astrid's son was born on the 3rd of February. He was healthy, fully formed, vigorous, with the color in his face that I had learned to look for and often did not find in winter births. Astrid had eaten the carrots and the turnips steadily through the last 3 weeks of her pregnancy, and whatever they had given her body had been passed forward to the child in the way that such things are passed, invisibly, through the ordinary miracle of gestation. I noted the birth in my patient ledger in the manner I noted all births: date, presentation, outcome, condition of mother and child. I wrote, "Full term, no complications, thriving," 10 words. The most important 10 words in my ledger from that entire winter, and I wrote them in approximately 10 seconds, which is a disproportion I have not been entirely comfortable with since. The child was named Eric, after Marin's husband. Jonas told me this when I visited the following week, and told me also that it had been Astrid's decision, made without explanation, in the way that Astrid made most of her decisions, quietly, with complete certainty, and without inviting discussion. The knowledge moved through the valley the way practical knowledge moves in small communities. Not through announcement, not through any formal declaration, but through the specific mechanism of one neighbor speaking to another neighbor about a thing that had worked. By March, when the snow began its slow recession and the roads became passable again in the afternoons, Jonas had told 4 families what he knew. Not what he understood. He understood very little of the engineering and was honest about this, but what he had seen and what it had provided. 4 families came to the North Hill in the first week of March, and Marin showed them what she had built, and answered their questions in the manner she answered all questions, briefly, concretely, and without sentiment. She took them to the hillside behind her property and handed each of them a fistful of soil from different locations, and ask them to close their eyes and tell her what they felt. She was not testing them. She was teaching them to read the material they would be working with, because a cellar built in the wrong soil, or at the wrong angle, or without the correct ventilation, would fail the way her first cellar had failed, and she did not intend to send them home with instructions that would produce rot. Britta Halverson came on the second Saturday of March, having said nothing to anyone about her intentions. She walked up the north hill and stood beside Marin at the entrance to the chamber, and she put her hand on the wooden frame of the outer door and felt the warmth coming through it, and she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Show me where to put mine." They spent the morning walking the slope behind the Halverson property, Marin pressing her palm to the hillside at intervals, reading what the soil reported. When she found the location, a north-facing section where the loess was deepest and the drainage ran correctly away from the hill, she set her hand flat against it for a long count and then removed it and said, "Here." Britta looked at the spot. She looked at her friend. Then she knelt down and pressed her own palm to the hillside and counted, and felt what the earth maintained beneath the surface of all weather and all winter, patient and constant and entirely sufficient. She said nothing. She stood and dusted her hands, and they walked back down the hill together. Harlan Voss did not visit the cellar. He heard about it from Jonas in February and from 3 other families in March, and he absorbed the information with the manner of a man who is processing a significant revision to his understanding of the world without any intention of allowing that revision to be visible. He did not argue. He did not dismiss. He asked once a single practical question: how long does the construction take? 3 weeks, Jonas told him, for one person. Voss nodded and said nothing further. In July of 1882, a supply wagon arrived from the railhead carrying Voss's summer order. I happened to be at the store when it was unloaded, settling an account, and I watched the inventory come off the wagon with the idle attention of a man with nothing pressing to do. There were the expected goods: flour, salt, dried beans, lamp oil, and there were, stacked in wooden crates in the back of the wagon, 200 canning jars. And behind the canning jars, 3 seed catalogs from an Eastern agricultural supplier. Voss did not comment on these items. He directed them to the back of the store and recorded them in his ledger and moved on to the next item on the manifest. I understood, watching him write in his ledger, that this was how Harlan Voss processed a change that he could not argue with and would not celebrate. He ordered canning jars. He ordered seed catalogs. He repositioned himself quietly and without drama in relation to a new reality that he had not anticipated and could not have created, but was entirely capable of recognizing once it existed. He was, in his way, adapting. It was not a generous adaptation, and it contained no acknowledgment of what had made it necessary. But it was real, and in a man of his nature and position, it was the closest available equivalent to the gesture another kind of man might have made more openly. I am looking at my patient ledger now, the volume for 1882. I turn to the February pages. I have turned to them many times over the years, in the way that you return to the evidence that corrected a significant error, not to punish yourself with it, but to maintain the correction against the natural human tendency to drift back toward old assumptions. The February pages of 1882 have 4 entries: a broken arm from a fall on ice, a respiratory infection in an elderly man who recovered fully by March, a case of frostbite, moderate, affecting 2 fingers of the right hand, a note about a difficult labor that resolved without complication. No child deaths, not one. I turned back to the February pages of 1881, 3 entries, 2 of them are children. I turned to 1880, 2 children. I turned to 1879, 1 child and 1 woman of 32 whose death I had attributed at the time to the accumulated weakness of a difficult winter, and whom I understand now to have died in part from the same absence that the February children died from, the same slow insufficiency the same body asking for something the available diet could not provide. After 1882, the February pages are different. They remain occupied, where winter is still winter, and the frontier is still the frontier, and people still fall and freeze and sicken in the ways available to them. But the particular kind of entry that had appeared in February every year, without exception from 1878 to 1881, does not appear again. Not in 1883, not in 1884, not in any February for the remaining decades of my practice. The blank pages begin in 1882, and they do not stop. I set my pen down and look out the window at the October light on the cottonwoods, and I think about a woman walking a hill in the early morning, pressing her palm to the earth, counting to 20 in the silence before the day began. She spent 40 years on that hill. She outlasted the men who had managed the valley and the systems they had built and the assumptions they had organized their authority around. She lived quietly in her cabin and tended her cellar and taught one family at a time the knowledge that had crossed an ocean in her memory and proved in the end more durable than anything constructed above the ground. She did not consider herself extraordinary. I know this because I asked her, in one of the last conversations I had with her before she died, whether she understood what she had done for the valley. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I kept the carrots alive. The carrots did the rest. I have written a great many things in 11 ledgers, diagnoses and treatments and outcomes, and the careful clinical language of a profession that I have tried to practice well. But the entries I return to most often are the ones that are not there, the blank February pages that begin in 1882 and extend year after year to the end of my records." She put those blanks there. I only wrote them down.